Hello, and welcome to the eighth and final installment of the speaker series, The Liberal Imaginary and Beyond. The aim of this speaker series is to examine the origins, the contents, and development of liberalism after the Second World War, as well as to consider significant attempts to move beyond the resultant social imaginary without casting aside its impressive achievements. This series is co-sponsored by the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. I would like to note that the Institute for Public Knowledge has withdrawn its sponsorship of this particular event in order to stand in solidarity with the ongoing graduate student strike at New York University. I'm Benjamin Schewel, a senior fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, and I'll be one of your hosts for this event.
And I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. And together, Ben and I direct the Center on Modernity and Transition. As Ben mentioned, the topic of today's conversation is Confucianism and modern political thought. To discuss this with us, we're delighted to be joined by two of the world's preeminent experts on the subject. Joseph Chan is professor of philosophy at the University of Hong Kong and author of Confucian Perfectionism, A Political Philosophy for Modern Times. David Wong is the Susan Fox Beischer and George D. Beischer Professor of Philosophy at Duke University and author of Natural Moralities, A Defense of Pluralistic Relativism. David, Joseph, a very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you. Pleasure.
As our loyal audience members by now know, we like to begin each conversation in this series on a more intimate and biographical note. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about the personal histories and experiences that have led you to think about and write about Confucianism and modern political philosophy. In other words, what are some of the personal and intellectual pathways that have brought you to this topic? Joseph, perhaps we could start with you.
Okay, thanks. I wasn't a student of Chinese philosophy or Confucianism when I was an undergrad. I majored in politics and with a special interest in Western political theory. I minored in philosophy, and because of that, I studied a year course in Chinese philosophy. So, but looking back, I think my interest in Confucianism developed in three phases. The first phrase was when I was an undergrad reading Chinese philosophy. I started reading the works of modern Confucian scholars such as Tang Junyi and Xu Fuguan and Mao Zhongshan. I found that I had much to learn from their works, and I also had much to agree with their attempts to integrate Confucianism with Western liberal and democratic thoughts. I find this integration pretty natural to me because I grew up in Hong Kong in the 1970s and 80s, which was still a colony of Hong Kong, a colony of the United Kingdom at that time. The local tradition of Hong Kong, namely Chinese Confucian culture, was largely left untouched by the colonial non-interventionist policies. And many Hong Kong's people's experience of Chinese culture was positive, and that of British culture not negative at all, despite the British domination through colonial rule. So what I and many other Hong Kong people experienced was not so much a clash of Chinese and Western cultures as their mutuality. Through persistence, through creativity and pragmatism, the men and women of Hong Kong, both Chinese and British, turned what would otherwise be dogmatic antagonism into a kind of productive integration. So that was the first phase of my sort of interest in Confucianism. The second phase was when I began to think about going abroad to pursue graduate study in political philosophy. I started to, get some advice from my college teachers, most of whom advised against it. But one approved and encouraged me to do it. For he said to me that China at that time really didn't have a political philosophy suitable for the modern world. And he said we needed people to study political philosophy, including Western, so as to help develop a political philosophy for modern Chinese society. Well, at that time, I found this task too daunting, too much for me. And I thought I would only do it after immersing myself in Western political philosophy for 2 or more decades, so as to build a solid foundation for the challenging task of developing a new Confucian political philosophy. But that task or that mission was somehow ingrained or imprinted in my mind. And now let me come to the last phase, which is when I returned to Hong Kong after my graduate study in 1990 and began teaching in the University of Hong Kong. During that time, I was often asked by foreign scholars in conferences what I thought about Chinese or Confucian perspectives on the hot issues of the day. And at that time, the hot issues were issues about human rights. Are human rights universal? Is democracy universal? And Asian values, are there such thing as Asian values? And as a student of Western political thought, I found myself totally unprepared for those questions. Mm-hmm. So I had no choice but to start the project of understanding and even reconstructing Confucian political thought to see if it can shed any light, useful light, interesting light on contemporary issues. And then the rest is history. I continue to work on it till today.
Thank you, Joseph. David, how about you?
Well, I was born and grew up Chinese American in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My family came from the Toisan region of southern China, not far from where Joseph was born and raised. In Minneapolis, at the time I grew up there, there was just a very small Chinese American community. So the differences between my family and the way they raised me were pretty apparent. The largest groups there at the time were Scandinavian and German Americans, but also a fairly prominent African American community. And of course, that has hit the news pretty prominently lately. When I went to graduate school, I decided to write on issues of relativism and ethical theory. And I thought that one way that I could contribute was to take seriously the question of cultural differences and values. The thing is, in the philosophy department, there was no serious reference to any cultural tradition other than those of ancient Greece, of Western Europe, and the US. And Joseph's recounting of how he was encouraged or discouraged from Chinese philosophy studies sort of reminds me that I wasn't encouraged. But nevertheless, I decided to go ahead anyway. And it was pretty natural for me to turn to the Chinese tradition, given the questions my own upbringing had brought up in my mind. So that led me to focus on the difference in between traditions in their attention to values of relationship and responsibility to others on the one hand, and autonomy and rights on the other hand. And so I did start writing on that, both beginning pretty firmly grounded in analytic ethical theory, but then sort of being increasingly drawn into the Chinese tradition and my realizing, hey, there's a lot here that's really interesting in its own terms. And so I've become sort of greatly appreciative of the Chinese tradition, keeping my comparative aims in mind, but independent of any comparative aims I might have begun with. I see that tradition worth investigating and worth carrying on and into the contemporary era. So that's where I am now.
Thank you both very much for those illuminating personal histories. So to move on to our main subject matter, I want to begin with a broad framing question. So what do you each see as the core distinctive ideas of Confucianism and Confucian ethics? And how would you relate these to liberal political philosophy and thought? Maybe David, we can start with you.
Okay, well, let me just preface this by saying, of course, this is going to be my individual take on Confucianism, and you're going to get some significant variance in this. For me, there's the first thing I'd mention is the primary value as an ethic placed on relationship. And Analects 526 puts it pretty perfectly for me. On one translation, I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged. Confucius said in answer to this question that was turned around on him when he posed it to his students, what would you most like to do? And they gave their answers, and he then asked him, what would you most like to do, master? And he said, I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged, to share relationships of trust and confidence with my friends, and to love and protect the young. And if I had just a few words to encapsulate an ethic, those would be pretty much what I would choose. That's related to a second feature that I associate with Confucianism, which is the interdependent nature of human life. And of course, this is very much relevant with the pandemic, of how we can't help but breathe each other's air, breathe each other's breath, for good or ill. And of course, the interdependent nature of human life with nature, even more alarming and pressing is the issue of climate change. So then that's the second feature. Thirdly, I'd appreciate the contextuality and flexibility of thought about how to preserve and sustain relationship, which I think comprehends a recognition of the need to accommodate to others when one disagrees and comes into conflict with them. As I delved into the Confucian tradition, I learned to set aside certain stereotypes of it as trying to banish contest or disagreement in favor of shared understanding. Certainly, shared understanding is a necessity, but just how much of it and how it interacts with contest and disagreement is very much a live issue in Confucianism. So in this regard, Analects 1323 is very much a signpost for me. The Junzi, the exemplary person, pursues harmony rather than sameness. The small person does the opposite. So that right away tells us that there's something about being able to work with others, to get along with them, to live with them well. That's not the same thing as trying to make them believe the same thing. So this says to me, there's a concept of human fulfillment as lying in relationship with others, that highlights the need to conciliate and accommodate others as one inevitably comes into conflict with them. And then I just finally would say that, maybe two things more. There's moral cultivation more than any other ethical tradition I know of. Confucianism pays attention to processes of development of the person, not surprisingly, within the matrix of their relationships. But it calls our attention to the role of cultural tradition in cultivation and to rituals, these practices that mark major life passages, mourning and burial, birth and marriage, but also the daily ceremonies that penetrate our lives, taking meals with others, taking notice and greeting them. All these play a major role in shaping who we are, whether or not we actually recognize them. I think Confucianism is quite distinctive in the way that it recognizes the importance of relationship, culture, and ritual in shaping who we are. And then finally, this I think I learned from Joseph as a distinctive feature of Confucianism, which is the allotment of the most responsibility on those who have shown them trustworthy and competent, and how that is something worth considering and bringing forward into our own times. I have maybe some words to say about how I combine that with another school of Chinese philosophy, the Taoists. But I'll end there for this question.
Thank you so much, David. So Joseph, again, I'll pose you the same question. What do you see as the core distinctive ideas of Confucianism, Confucian ethics, and how do these relate to liberal political philosophy?
Well, first, I'd like to say I agree with a lot of what David just said. Can you hear me? Okay. But again, like David, let me offer my own take of Confucianism's central features. First, I'd like to say I was struck by some of the more structural features of Confucianism. Confucianism in its ethical, social, and political dimensions. I like to use the word perfectionism to characterize the structural features. On ethics, Confucianism bases its ethical judgments about values, judgments about virtues and norms. In short, its conception of the good life on its understanding of human nature or humanity. So I would call this ethical perfectionism. And on society, Confucianism regards social groups such as the family and the social relationships beyond the family as important sites where people develop their ethical capacities and skills, which are necessary for the good life. So I call this social perfectionism. And on politics, Confucianism holds, holds the view that one of the major aims of the state is to help people pursue the good life by various means, by the means of law, education, rituals, as David refers to, provision of means of resources, and coordination of social groups and their activities. I call this political perfectionism. Now, of course, classical Greek thoughts are also perfectionist in these senses. But Confucianism differs from these classical thoughts in substantive contents. For example, Confucianism emphasizes a great deal on the family as the site of moral cultivation. One starts one's life in family, appreciating the love of parents and learning how to conduct one's relationship with your parents, including respect, but including also following rituals set in the family. Confucianism emphasizes also on the need of learning of texts, learning of rituals and participation in rituals, on the importance of practice of virtue in whatever social environments one finds herself in the family, in the workplace, in the courts, in neighborhoods, in foreign countries. Confucianism also stresses the importance of giving people sufficient material resources for living a life of virtuous practice. But most important of all, I think Confucianism puts a great deal of responsibility on the educated class, and especially on those who are in power. They must serve the people. They must try to create an environment which is helping people to cultivate a good life. And these people, those leaders, must try their best to win the people's trust and their voluntary support. And also, they should do so by setting themselves as moral exemplars for others. Confucianism, at the end of the day, believes in the power of education, the power of ritual and personal edification, rather than the power of institutions. Now, you asked about how it relates to liberal and democratic thought. I think Confucians, compared with the liberal democratic tradition, Confucianism's strength is also its limitation. The strength is on the emphasis of the software of society, people's attitudes, habits, behavior, character, rather than the hardware. And as you can immediately see, a more balanced view would be having a set of both, which mutually supporting each other. And so I think that is the way to go as far as a modernizing project of Confucianism or a revisiting liberal democratic tradition is concerned. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those framing comments. As you know, as Ben mentioned, this is the 8th and final installment in this series. And over the course of the preceding 7 conversations, we've invited speakers to address the various social and political crises that confront us, whether, specifically here in the West or at a broader planetary level. These pressing challenges that confront humanity, of course, are well known. David started to talk about them. We're in the midst of an urgent global crisis of ecological sustainability. The global pandemic has further exposed economic inequalities, both within and across countries. Here in the American context, liberal democracy, long regarded one of America's most cherished accomplishments, has suffered crises in recent months. And of course, our very profound struggle with racial injustice in this country continues. But before we ask you to reflect on possible solutions to these challenges, I want to start at the level of diagnosis. How do the distinctive conceptual tools of Confucian thought help us to diagnose the source of these various crises? And how might the conceptual resources of Confucianism lead to a different framing of our problems than the ones we typically arrive at using the tools of liberal political thought? Joseph, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks. This is a very difficult question, and let me see if I could, handle it well. But first, when we say how Confucianism might tackle these issues, or how it helped us to provide a diagnosis of those crises, we must distinguish between Confucian philosophy and Confucian practice in history. The latter could well be pretty perverted, in actual practices. So when we are talking about how Confucianism may help us diagnose contemporary issues, I focus on its philosophy, its normative vision, which at times I concede may strike people as too high sounding or too demanding. But let's say if it is, if it can offer any useful and realistically valuable thought. I would just talk about two crises. One is what you refer to, the crisis of ecological sustainability, and then the crisis of liberal democracy. I think Confucianism might say that the global crisis of ecological sustainability is a result of a strong anthropocentric worldview, one that sees human beings as at the center of the world, as the dominants of the natural world. A traditional Chinese metaphysics or cosmological view, however, doesn't privilege human beings in the cosmic scheme of things. Confucianism stresses as David alluded to, stresses the interdependence of yin and yang, heaven, earth, nature, and man. These are all interdependent things. In the creation and maintenance of the myriad things, each side in a pair has an indispensable role, but each cannot function without the other, and that's the idea of interdependence. Now, the Confucian classic the doctrine of the mean talks about the triad of heaven, earth, and humans. While heaven and earth create the hundreds of things in the world and determine their natures, human beings with complete sincerity can assist the transforming and nourishing powers of earth and heaven and give their full development to the natures of humans and animals. So an implication of this view is that human beings may assist the work of heaven and earth, but may not replace it. Now, what I say, I agree, is very abstract and it's not easy to explore the implications for ecological issues. But nevertheless, I think this Confucian worldview does indicate a certain spirit of humility towards the natural world. It does indicate an awareness of the necessity of humans to strike or maintain a mutually nourishing and interdependent relationship with nature. Now, let me quickly come to talk about the current crisis of democracy. Well, to the dismay of many democratic supporters, the year of 2019 may go down in the history of democratic development. It's a year of deep crisis. Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and the upsurge of nationalistic populism throughout Europe seems to have signaled a unprecedented failure of democracy. Well, a Confucian diagnosis of this may start by focusing on several interrelated sources of problems. First, a Confucian-minded person would say the current crisis of democracy is a crisis of the governing elites, and which ultimately leads to a crisis of political authority. Politics is about authority. It's about the sources of authority, the aim of authority, and its use. Now, the current crisis of democratic politics results from the failure of the governing elites to maintain the authority and exercises it responsibly. For Confucianism, there are two dimensions of an authoritative relations between those who govern and those who are governed. First dimension is those who govern must do their best to serve the people. Mm-hmm. Second, those who govern must do their best to win the trust of the people. They must do this by serving the people tirelessly and acting virtuously. And they must themselves live a life of integrity and virtue, avoiding any temptation or charge of corruption. Now, elites of this sort can establish a relationship of mutual trust and commitment with the people. the rise of populism in many places in the world, I think, strongly indicate that the people think that the elite has lost touch with them, unable to respond to their needs and become self-serving. So the rise of populism means, I think, the decline of the authority of the governing elites from a Confucian perspective. But second, I think the current crisis of democracy is also about the crisis of the people, the democratic people. I mean, when the people rise up against the establishment and challenge the elites, they may help reform and strengthen political institutions, making them more representative, accountable, or effective. But they may also undermine those democratic institutions, attack them, and the people can engage in equally self-serving, short-sighted politics. And when that happens, what we see is the people's sort of self-aggrandizing sense of entitlement, complacency, or limited imagination. Now, in a democracy, when the people are angry and they protest, their voices must be heeded. After all, for many democratically minded people, the people are sovereign. The people are the ultimate sources of authority. Well, I suspect that populism receives its moral legitimacy through the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Populism is always a potential risk in a democracy precisely because of its common belief in popular sovereignty. But the trouble is that when the sovereign people act irresponsibly or incompetently, there's no higher moral authority to constrain or resist them. Now, let me close by saying that I think it's interesting to observe that populism has not occurred in Northeast Asian democracies. I'm thinking of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And I suspect that the reason for this is that these three societies share a Confucian cultural heritage. Traditional Confucianism no doubt erred by giving too much role and power to the leaders and too little to the common people. But when Confucianism is situated in a democracy, it perhaps could function as a cultural mechanism to facilitate a healthy balance of meritorious leadership on the one hand and the people's control and participation on the other. So that's, I think, my take of how Confucianism may diagnose, the current problems.
Very interesting. David?
Yes, a lot of what I will say resonates with Joseph's analysis. With regard to the problem of ecological sustainability, I must say that I find early Confucianism more human-centered, and that with the Neo-Confucians, who we encounter centuries later, and their incorporation of Buddhism and Taoism, you do find a kind of expansion of concern and identification with the non-human and the natural worlds to a greater degree, which I find relevant to our times, and perhaps suggesting that not only should we be well advised to not despoil our home environment, but we would do well to acknowledge the role it plays in being our home, being the part of our identity, and that's something that we have to perhaps reconstruct, especially those of us who live in very built-up urban environments. We have, to a great extent, cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, and we could, in fact, benefit from reconnecting to that world, because we did evolve within nature, and there are parts of us that do respond and flourish in response to nature. And that might stand us in better stead as we struggle with the effects of our attempting to produce ourselves into a good human life. With regard to social turmoil, here I'm going to use Confucius again, 16:1 in the Analects. And this is Ames and Rosemanson translation. I have heard that the ruler of a state or the head of a household does not worry that their people are poor, but that wealth is inequitably distributed. Does not worry that the people are too few in number, but they are disharmonious. Does not worry that their people are unstable, but that they are insecure. So that says to me, income and wealth inequity is an important part of what's wrong, but they are the material basis for something that can be of greater importance, which again is the quality of relationships within a society. In 16:1, that's identified as disharmony and insecurity. I might cite Mencius, also 1A7, where he said, lacking a constant livelihood, the people will lack constant minds. And he goes on to describe that there will little that they will not do to sustain themselves without a lack of a constant heart and mind. So the problem is perhaps not fundamentally inequality in what people have. I think liberalism perhaps can be criticized for focusing too much on what people have and what they don't have, and not so much on relationships between people. What's important are the ramifications of inequality for relationships in a society, and the weak sense of a common fate that results, a loss of trust between powerful elites and the rest of us, and the perception of elites as motivated by their pursuit of personal profit and prestige. And as Joseph suggested, they're setting an example for the rest of us, giving us permission to do likewise. So I'll stop here for the moment.
So,
Joseph, did you want to respond to that? I couldn't tell if that was a... No. Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
well, so speaking of difficult questions, following the angle of diagnosis, we can then move to the question of solutions. As we look at these crises and these conflicts, particularly in the context of American public life, we can start to think, how might Confucianism help us resolve or propose resolutions to some of these scenarios? So let's imagine, through some wild turn of events, both the American public and American lawmakers become committed to reorienting their public norms, laws, and institutions in order to reflect the best of Confucian philosophical ideals. And they call on you, David Wong and Joseph Chan, to offer your recommendations. So what would be some of your suggestions? For example, how might American laws and institutions become better at sustaining the cultivation of virtues in society at large? Would you propose the creation of new institutions? Would you suggest that we reorient the nature and aspiration and methods of our public education system? In other words, what would you see as some of the concretely practical and public applications of Confucian thought in a Western society like the United States? So a very simple question to answer, David. We begin with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's the most intimidating question so far. And so I approach it with considerable humility, and, comforted only by the fact that people are all over are intimidated by that. And again, I want to warn that this is based on my version of Confucianism, which I would probably warn you is a kind of democratized egalitarian version. As my last answer might suggest, I think we do have to address inequity, but also, as Joseph highlighted, Confucianism places so much importance on the family. I mean, where we originate and where much of ourselves, our identities are formed. To address the instability and disharmony, the insecurity, I think we have to support families better. So Erin Klein, in her book, Families of Virtue, highlights the importance that Confucianism places on the parent-child relationship to people's moral development and their well-being. She argues that we would do well to take that in, and points to contemporary programs designed to support vulnerable families in their rearing of children. One of them she mentions is the Nurse Family Partnership, which focuses on low-income unmarried, that is, and adolescent first-time mothers. And it brings to them specially trained nurses to visit them during their pregnancies and continuing until the child is 2. And the focus there is not just on good health habits for both mother and child, though those are just very important, but also providing attentive, competent care for infants. And the program has demonstrable good effects. Every rigorous study on them has shown that. But practically no one knows about it, and it has not gotten the resources that it should have in a society with the resources that we have here. So that's one sort of thing we can do. And there are lots of other things we could do. I mean, it's about time for us to have in this society paid parental leave. And a concerted societal effort to stress the responsibility of men in families to put in the time and nurture into the care and rearing of children. As I think contemporary Confucians have learned from feminism. Amy Olberding, in her scholarship on Confucianism, has highlighted the value of rituals that she now calls civility. She originally called rituals manners, but then changed the terminology because of our American tendency to trivialize manners. But how we talk to each other, our habits of conversation and deliberation is important. And we would do well to adopt rituals that train us in habits of curiosity, receptivity, and hearing others out. And we should teach these rituals in schools at the site where we put a lot of our effective investments in our children. It matters to us what our children are taught, and that's why we should put more thought into what they're taught and how they're taught. I think Well, here's another thing that's quite unlikely, but I'll mention it anyway, which is I think we should have mandatory national service, and that this service should be in domains chosen to bring each younger citizen into contact with other citizens from a wide variety of backgrounds. We are just so siloed in American society these days that we hardly know each other is one reason for our enmity and antagonism towards each other, besides the skill of those who use it to turn us against each other. But here's something I would take from Joseph. I don't know if he has gone beyond this, or I'd be interested to hear. But in his Confucian perfectionism, he, drawing from the tradition of Confucian thought, proposes a meritocratically selected legislative chamber, selected from those who have demonstrated trustworthiness and competence. And that could be from a number of areas of life in which they've demonstrated this competence. Some of those might be from the civil service. And I must say that comes to mind recently because among those who stood up to outrageous goings-on acts from the previous administration were those from the civil service who demonstrated an admirable degree of integrity and principle. And they were among those who saved us, I think, by standing up. And that with a democratically elected chamber that's not gerrymandered. But I think as long as we're talking about reform, elected from larger districts from which there can be more than one representative, selected by rank-ordered vote, so that we just have a greater variety of representation. And a third element I would suggest, which is I have a Confucian reason and a Taoist reason for, which is the institutionalization of a citizens' assembly. The idea there being to choose people at random from the citizenry so that the sampling is representative of the population, where they might be given the task of shaping a legislative agenda, making proposals to the other chambers. There could be further flexibility as to what their role could be. I would like them actually to have an even weightier role. But the Confucian reason for that is that if education of the people is as crucial as education of the elites, and this is something I also learned from Joseph, then the education should focus not just on being taught, but on people doing it, learning to work with each other, and where the working with is on something that counts. Too much of our education is done in arenas where it doesn't really count, or there's too little writing on it. And people are more motivated when what they're doing counts, where it matters, what they do and what they decide. So that's the Confucian reason, the education involved. The Taoist reason is epistemic, and that is, where I think Taoism complements Confucianism is with a healthy skepticism about the wisdom of those deemed to be knowledge and virtue elites. They always are wary of the partiality of the received wisdom, and they advocate openness and receptivity to those who do not get official approval. I think a lot of that viewpoint can be confirmed. That's the Taoist reason for a citizen assembly. That's on you, Joseph.
So Joseph, with our unfair, overwhelming question, we now turn to you.
That's an impossible question to me, especially because I'm not American. And I really have to defer to David, and listening to him, I find a lot of what he suggested very sensible, although difficult to implement, but I think that is the right way to go. And I also agree with David that Confucianism perhaps would benefit from having a dose of Taoism, because Confucianism may at times strike people as being too moralistic, to focus on what we could achieve in terms of our moral achievement, what we should expect of each other in terms of our moral cultivation. Taoism perhaps reminds us of our fragility of being human, and our need to tolerate each other's failings, as well as to encourage people just to be themselves and live, a natural life. So I think that Taoist sort of perspective, has always emphasized in David's own writing, is very, very important. My own thought is very abstract, because I'm not American, but I've lived in America for a couple of years now, putting my several visits all together. I think, a Confucian-minded person would emphasize a lot about the importance of virtue. But what strikes me is, when I talk with Americans, especially American academics, virtue is not a concept or language that appears at all in their discussion or in their writings. They prefer a lot more to talk about concepts of equality or liberty. And so when they see problems in society, what they try to do is to ask what the resources of liberal democracy could provide them to tackle. So they would try to refresh our understanding of liberty and equality, or even to extend our democratic practices to a more, sort of a perfect degree, so that, current problems could be avoided or overcome. So seldom does the concept of virtue appear to them as a part of any solution, as it were. But virtue, of course, is, from a contemporary point of view, a dated concept. I mean, it is only being used in certain corners of America, like the Christian, Protestant, or Catholic traditions. But I remember when I was reading the works of founding fathers of America, they used the word a lot in their reflections about what American politics should be like and what the Constitution should be like, for the future of America. And so I can see a lot of resonance of Confucian emphasis of virtue in the early Republican writings of the founding fathers of America. Unfortunately, their emphasis again slowly, declined and disappeared in the development of American politics, and maybe sometimes for plausible reasons, because virtue is very hard to maintain, even harder to engineer. And when we see problems, we try to fix the problems by reforming the institution, reforming the laws. Institutions and laws are easier to pin down and reform, but it's much more difficult to engineer the habits of the heart of the people. So Confucianism, David said many times, and also said it, that Confucianism said we should start our moral education from the family. But in contemporary society today, I mean, I think it might be too much to expect individual parents to shoulder the responsibility of moral education of their children when the whole social and political environment is not conducive to such. And so I think perhaps we should use, the advantages of modern technology such as social media or movies, use those soft powers, as it were, means of soft power, to promote what seem to be the public to be certain traditional or even outdated concept of virtue, a virtuous life, and the importance of family and social relationships. To do this, I think we need talented, creative individuals who understand the old world and the necessity of the modern language, and somehow integrate the two together through powerful images, novels, storytelling, and social media. So that's all I could say. It's very abstract, sorry.
Well, that actually leads, I think, very nicely into our next question. Joseph, in your book, Confucian Perfectionism, which we've referenced a few times now, you offer what I found to be a very interesting reflection on the future of political philosophy. In that passage, you write, and now I'm quoting, "It has been said that modernity is like an adolescent struggling for liberation from the bondage of tradition. When the young man matures, he learns to appreciate the wisdom of tradition. With this in mind, if we try to predict the dominant philosophical perspective half a century from now, we may find that rather than having replaced the traditional language of virtue, responsibility, and benevolent care, the modern language of freedom, rights, and democracy will have been enriched by it, and that modern values and ancient wisdom will have blended to form a more mature mode of human thinking and living. It is this hope," you write, "that underlies this project of the critical reconstruction of Confucian political philosophy." Joseph, I want to invite you to speak a bit more about this imagined future of political thought. What would a more mature political philosophy or philosophical discourse look like? Or to put it perhaps a little bit differently, how would you further elaborate the features of this more mature mode of human thinking that you envision?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for referring to what I said in the preface of the book. I said in the preface that this is what I wanted to do. And I think, to answer the question, I may just refer you and the audience to my book, because my book is an attempt to outline that what I think is a more mature mode of political philosophy and human thinking and living. But I have very little time now, so you won't expect me to go into the details. But maybe I just give a few examples, if I can, within very limited time, of how I see the ancient wisdom of the human world, Greek and Confucian, could be integrated with the most modern ideas of liberty and equality and rights. Now, first, I think I would say very quickly what I said already earlier, that Confucianism sees politics as more a matter of responsibility than the entitlement of the right holder of political offices, including the democratic voters who also hold certain power as voters. Voting rights, no doubt, give people a greater discretion to make choices, what representatives to choose, and what laws in the referendum or policies to decide on, to pick. But like any discretionary rights in politics, the discretionary rights of judges, of police officers, the voters must also exercise their voting rights responsibly. So this is how I see the balance. You have discretion as a voter to do whatever you want with your vote, but you better exercise your vote responsibly with the common interest in mind. And this leads to a broader kind of balancing of individual right and individual virtue. Rights are an important fallback mechanism to protect one's legitimate interests. But rights could be abused too, when right holders press their rights too hard against others in inappropriate ways. Well, sometimes I think it's better to resolve conflicts of interest by not pressing your right, but by engaging in some kind of communication, mediation or reconciliation or compromises. But in order not to abuse one's right, one needs a theory of virtue to guide the right holders in the exercise of the right. And so I think ancient wisdom precisely gives you a rich theory of virtues. You can find it in Confucianism, but it's not confined to Confucianism. You can find it in Stoicism, in Aristotelian ethical tradition, or in the Christian tradition too. What is important is that we see virtue and rights coming together in this more balancing mode of living and thinking. And finally, justice and care. In contemporary society, we talk a lot about justice, distributive justice, equality. And when there is inequality, injustice, we want to rectify it by pressing our rights, reforming institutions. But the ancient wisdom of thought would say, well, we should also try to integrate justice with a personal dimension of care and responsibility, as well as individual merit, into a coherent system. For example, for Confucianism, justice requires equity or equitable distribution in resources distributed by the government, yes, by all means. But members of our household must also work together and labor hard to be able to harvest well, to make a living for themselves. Confucianism also prefers assistance coming from the family and social ties through personal health care. And they find it preferable to governmental help because, personal assistance stems from caring and concern and may be more effective when the caregiver better understands the needs and problems of those who seek assistance. So mutual aid, I think, is an important arena in our thought of social justice. And at the end, we hope to develop a system of justice, a regime of justice and care, and one that doesn't eliminate personal responsibility and personal care. So this is how I would go about outlining a kind of more balancing mode of living together as individual, and as community.
David, how would you respond to that question? What are some elements, at least, of your conception of a more mature form of political thought and political philosophical discourse?
Well, I would agree a lot with what Joseph has said. I have also thought that we have to rethink the relationship between individual rights and good relationships. Whether I'm able to have my rights recognized and able to exercise them effectively depends on whether others care about my rights. And that's part of the problem here. We're most of us care enough about our own rights, although maybe that could be put into question, depending on what the rights are. But we don't care enough about everyone else's rights. And it's insufficient that the importance of rights be just a matter of principle for others and myself. I do think that the underwriting of rights has to ultimately rest in a sense of, as I was saying earlier, a sense of shared faith with others whose rights we are expected to defend. And I think it's this link this positive link between rights and relationships is not given sufficient consideration in modern liberal thought, because it's often the importance placed on rights is associated with a perpetual tension between effectively acknowledging the rights of individuals on the one hand, and on the other hand, maintaining an effective sense of shared fate with others. They're viewed as not very compatible, actually. And that's, I think, in turn because rights are often, at least especially the US, conceived as claims made for the security of certain interests one has against others, who are conceived as potential aggressors or encroaching upon our interests. But this assumption that I think we make rather easily and automatically in American culture is not a universal assumption. In the US, it's the one we tend to make, but it's not nearly so prevalent, say, in the country immediately north of us, which is Canada. And so we have to think about how rights are conceived and implemented differently. That we tend to see everything through the prism of Americanness, I think, here, and to imprint everyone else with our preconceptions and assumptions. But I think one benefit of Confucianism is that it questions this assumption of inherent conflict between the interests of the individual and the interests of others. It may not always be right in its assumption that I think there's the mainstream of Confucianism is that it can always be worked out, that the interests of the individual and of others can always be reconciled and made compatible. But this assumption is correct more often than we suppose, even if it's wrong sometimes. And the task of moral and political reasoning is to exert our knowledge and creative imaginations in the service of finding reconciliations between apparently conflicting interests. Another conception of rights that undermines this approach is the assumption that rights are these final trump cards. They're the ones that we throw on the table and say, end of conversation. And the problem is there are too many trump cards floating around. And all parties at the table are throwing their cards on the table and declaring end of conversation to everyone else, which is part of our problem of deadlock and stalemate. And so I think we have to change our conception of rights as, well, certainly bringing the urgency and importance of certain interests to the forefront of consideration, but they're not the end of the conversation, least of all for the reason that it's not settled that these important interests are in conflict with the important interests of others. We have to work that out. We have to set our task as the finding the ways to try to make them compatible if we can. So I think that's part of the problem we have with rights, which I think in Joseph's very apt call, we should rethink. But I think another part of the problem has been, on the other side, an overly romantic view of what harmonious relationships are like. Harmonious relationships for human beings need to affirm certain boundaries at times. And we may use rights to define those boundaries. The need may be especially strong for those boundaries when people are not so good at the contextual resolution of conflicts between their interests. And rights can serve as the protection of interests of the parties in relationships. And by protecting their interests in the long run, I think they can actually protect the relationships if they're not treated as these sort of absolute trump cards. But if they force us to consider how we might reconcile with each other. And I think one possibility for thinking about how to mitigate this tension between rights and relationships is to think of rights as providing presumptive protections with the burdens of justification on those who would set them aside for the sake of harmony in relationship. And I think this holds true especially for rights to freely criticize those who hold more power. That's an important function that rights have served and should continue to serve. But I think we also need to emphasize the responsibilities to provide conditions for what I referred to earlier, this mentioned constant livelihood, and identify those conditions necessary for the development of moral agency and the effective exercise of rights. So with that admittedly inadequate address of the question, I'll pause there.
Well, it is also a very natural segue into the next question. As you mentioned, the assumption that our interests and views are inherently contradictory or clashing is often much more stronger than the reality is on the ground. And when we move out to the global level and we think about the interaction of different ethical and philosophical and religious traditions, particularly from a Western standpoint, this framework of assumed conflict can be even more strong. So this kind of more mature ethical and political philosophical discourse, it would seem that one of its characteristics is that it would be more global or cosmopolitan in nature and scope. So how might you envision the rich diversity of traditions from around the world, perfectionist or otherwise, becoming mobilized in this more mature, common ethical and political discourse? Could insights derived from Confucian ethics or other sources, including liberal thought or other Chinese traditions, help us navigate the potential challenges of such a dialogue, namely the challenges of cultivating an overlapping consensus, to use the Rawlsian phrase, of core human values from the rich plurality of our ethical and political ideals? So, David, this being one of the topics you've spent your life thinking about, I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yes, thanks, Ben. Well, yes, one of the consistent themes of my work has been that different moral and political traditions answer to common problems of human life, but in different ways, and that there's no single correct way of solving those problems. There are some ways we can rule out as inadequate or wrong-headed or even monstrous, but we can't narrow it down to just one way. However, because of the broad outline of the problems we face is common, and because we share certain similarities with other human beings, we can recognize and come to appreciate the values embodied in other traditions. In fact, if our own traditions possess any degree of complexity and diversity at all, we can usually find analogs to values of other traditions within our own, even if they're spelled out somewhat differently by our tradition or given different priorities relative to other values. So, for example, the cultural psychologists Marcus and Connor have proposed that cultures vary in the emphasis they give to values of independence versus interdependence, but that cultures typically contain both kinds of value. And if we come to understand our differences, or at least many of the important ones in such terms, my hope is that we would be more willing to learn from each other. Cultures of interdependence offer a rich array of social structures and practices that foster this lived ethic of responsibility to others and this sense of shared fate. Cultures emphasizing an ethic of independence, for example, those putting individual rights at the center, can suffer from the centrifugal forces that pull people apart. And this especially because of the other forces at work in our contemporary era. Global capitalism, of course, being one of them, and the winner-take-all ethos that it seems to give rise to. So we need to look to ethics of interdependence and their ways of implementing them to see what we can draw from them. On the other hand, I think ethics of interdependence tend to suffer from overly restrictive ideals of harmony, as I was saying earlier. They do tend to equate harmony with sameness, which is what Confucius was warning against. And we do need to learn that harmony can include dimensions of disagreement and contest, and that the social whole can actually benefit from these things. To bring that off is, of course, no easy matter, but it's necessary. A comment about the term overlapping consensus that you used in your question, Ben. I suspect that you were using it in this broader, more intuitive sense than the one that Rawls sometimes gives it. And I think we tend to, at least when we take it more literally, it leads to this mistake of over-intellectualizing the problem, pinning everything down and achieving a certain degree of agreement. So the more severe formulation Rawls gives it in political liberalism is that we should fix once and for all the content of certain political basic rights and liberties, and to assign them special priority. And of course, these liberal principles include the basic political liberties, such as the right to vote, freedom of political speech and association, that Rawls thought might initially get adopted as a modus vivendi, political compromise based on the self or group interest between parties with conflicting comprehensive doctrines or different religious commitments. But his hope was that once we see the good that such liberties do, we find further ways to specify or fill in our partially comprehensive views, which he, I think, rightly viewed as somewhat malleable and indeterminate. Those views we have about the meaning and purpose of life and our religious or non-religious commitments. He hoped that we would further specify and fill them in as to be more compatible with the liberal political values. But I mean, if we see what's happening in the US now and many other parts of the world, we see widening disagreement over what the political liberties are and even who deserves to have them. Just a blatant willingness to deny them, in terms of voter suppression being one prominent example in the US. And that's what I mean by over-intellectualization, that thinking that the answer has to be coming to some agreement, especially some once and for all agreement, priority on these political liberties. I think this is a benefit of Confucianism. I think we need to get underneath these disagreements and see each other on a more elemental human level. And we don't need to eliminate all our important disagreements to do that. Perhaps I am wrong. I probably am wrong, given the difficulty of these questions. But I think Confucius was onto something when he said that disharmony and insecurity is what we must worry about at bottom. It's not just the threat of not having enough, but the threat of not being enough that too many of us are suffering from. And I think that's what we have to address, even that seems so difficult and daunting.
So, Joseph, maybe again, you can speak about the global or cosmopolitan dimensions or possibilities of this more mature form of ethical and political reflection that you envision.
Right. Okay. I think I share a lot of what David said. He, if I'm not mistaken, he found both commonalities and differences in different philosophical and cultural traditions, and both commonalities and differences tell us a lot of things, I think. And we should emphasize both. I mean, suppose I live in my own culture and immerse myself in this cultural tradition. And when I see other traditions sharing the same set of values, that shared values, that commonality, I think gives me hope and confidence in my own culture. And also give me, confidence that the other side actually are not my enemy and not as strangers that I cannot communicate with. But when I find differences from other cultures, mostly I find, it's not that I find values that are completely alien to me that I would never understand, but more or less the differences should be understood in terms of different priorities of values. So the fact that there are different priorities of values or ways of living in different cultures should remind us of our own epistemic limitations and limited horizon. And so commonalities give us hope and confidence. Differences remind us of the necessity of toleration and humility and modesty. But interestingly, this is the ideal. In history, human history, often the country that was in the center of the world, dominating the rest, would tend to see its own culture in universalistic terms and see other cultures as inferior, unequal, or something like that. In the past, China was a dominating power in the world, at least in Asia. And traditional Confucianism, I think, makes a lot of universalistic claims about values and human nature, rightly or wrongly. And to some extent, I still think traditional Confucianism allows a little bit too little room for value pluralism and also pluralism of ways of life. And I think this is partly because China was already a pretty advanced nation among, Zhongguo, the center of the Middle Kingdom, was the more advanced culture and nation in the region. And so they thought, they understood, everything universally, in universalistic terms. But today, in the Western hegemonic era, I think it's just the opposite. The West tended to see its own culture and ways of living as universalistic. And they showed relatively less interest in how other cultures and countries practice, human living. And so the interesting thing is there is a reversal. Now, Confucians and Asians and non-Western people like Islamic people, African people, they are much more aware of their own limitations and aware of the presence, if not the hegemony, of Western ideological apparatus and philosophical traditions. And so they has less, problem of, taking their own perspective as natural and universal than, the Western people may have. So I think if one needs to kind of promote a kind of global cross-cultural dialogue and to cultivate an overlapping consensus of core human values, I think it should first of all start with the West. Because, for example, we Chinese have been looking to the West for more than 100, 200 years. And we have no trouble understanding the West. But the West has trouble understanding, the non-West, the rest of the world, except those political elites, because of their diplomacy, they need to, deal with foreign and international affairs. They know a lot, but most common people, may not have the incentive or feel the necessity to know the rest of the world. So that's why I think there's a new subdiscipline called comparative political theory. It emerges from Western scholars because they now feel that their tradition of Western political thought, their educational curriculum, is a bit too narrow. And so they have tried with special effort and courageous and very sort of praiseworthy effort to enlarge their own canon, as it were, to include non-Western canons of thought. I see this as a very worthwhile project, not just now in political theory, but also in perhaps comparative philosophy too. Although this is something that we Hong Kong people, Chinese people, other non-Western people have been doing for ages. And so, the call for globalization and global talk is rightly taking place from the West. And I hope, this will continue to promote a healthy dialogue with all peoples in the world.
Well, David and Joseph, I wanted to thank you both for joining us today for what I think we all feel has been a very stimulating and enriching conversation. So, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And thank you, David, too. Learned a lot from what you said.
It's great to see you again, Joseph.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great to see you again. Hope to see you again soon.
Yeah.
And the other two, too.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. And that concludes this speaker series, The Liberal Imaginary and Beyond. Ben and I want to thank all the speakers whose deep thinking and openness to dialogue have so greatly enriched these conversations over the last several months. We'd also like to thank the three sponsors of this series for their vital support: the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. And of course, many thanks to all of you for joining us. Note that you can find videos of all the events in this speaker series on YouTube. The link to that YouTube channel has just been posted in the chat. And finally, plans are underway for exciting new speaker series in the upcoming academic year. So keep an eye out for those details in the coming months. Thank you again, everyone. Have a happy, healthy, and safe summer.